Father Gabriel sat quietly in his seat, hands folded in his lap, gazing out the small airplane window as the plane prepared for takeoff. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He had just finished a busy month of leading a retreat for the young members of St. Mark's Church, guiding them through difficult discussions about faith and their places in the world. It had been an exhausting but fulfilling experience. Now, he was on his way to Leuven for a brief break before returning to his duties. Gabriel's appearance had always been a conversation starter. His long, graying hair, the flowing robe he wore with pride, and the gold cross that hung prominently around his neck. It wasn't something that bothered him, it was just part of who he was. He'd taken vows to serve his faith and his community, and part of that service was living openly as a symbol of peace and spirituality. Yet, over the years, he'd learned that people often saw only the surface. They didn't see the depth of his heart or the quiet power of his convictions. To some, his attire marked him as different, too different to fit into the norms of society. But on this particular flight, Gabriel felt a sense of calm. He had come to appreciate moments like these, brief intervals of stillness between the rush of his duties. There was something meditative about being suspended in the air, so high above the world, yet grounded in the present moment. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, assisting passengers with seatbelts and overhead compartments. Gabriel offered a polite smile as one of them passed. His mind wandered to the retreat he had just finished, and the young faces that had left an impact on him. He thought of the way they had opened up, sharing their struggles and aspirations. There was something profoundly hopeful in seeing their eagerness to find meaning in a world that often seemed indifferent to their concerns. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure approach, an airport security officer, a woman whose sharp, calculating gaze seemed to scan each passenger as if measuring them for potential danger. He noticed the firm posture, the crisply pressed uniform, the way she moved purposefully down the aisle. At first, Gabriel thought nothing of it. It was only when the officer stopped in front of his seat that he sensed something wasn't quite right. "Sir, may I speak with you for a moment?" she said, her voice clipped, but polite. Gabriel raised an eyebrow, a sense of confusion creeping into his mind. "Of course," he replied, standing slowly, his movements deliberate. "Please follow me, sir." "We need to ask you to leave the plane," she said, her tone now devoid of the polite formality from earlier. There was an authority in her voice that made Gabriel's stomach tighten. "Excuse me?" Gabriel said, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Why would I need to leave? Is there a problem?" The woman didn't respond to his question directly. Instead, she looked behind her, as though signaling to others. Gabriel noticed two more security officers emerging from the back of the plane, walking toward them with deliberate steps. The tension in the cabin grew palpably as passengers shifted in their seats, trying to make sense of the unfolding situation. "I'm afraid there's been a security concern, sir." "Please, gather your belongings," the officer said, her tone now more forceful. "I don't understand," Gabriel protested, but he could feel the eyes of everyone in the cabin upon him now. There was no way to hide. He had never been the type to seek attention, but now it was impossible to avoid. The officer gestured to the aisle, her gaze fixed on him with a sense of urgency that he couldn't quite comprehend. "Sir, please. You'll need to come with us." Gabriel stood there for a moment, bewildered. He wanted to ask more questions, to try to understand why he was being singled out in this way. But something in the officer's demeanor told him that it would do no good. This wasn't a conversation, it was an order. He glanced around the cabin. Some passengers were looking at him with wide eyes, while others seemed more focused on their phones, pretending not to notice. A few faces, however, seemed uncomfortable, shifting nervously in their seats. Gabriel couldn't help but wonder what they were thinking. Had they seen something in him that made them uneasy? Was it the robe, the cross, the very fact that he looked different from the typical business travelers on this flight? He had never felt so out of place, so exposed. Without further protest, Gabriel began to gather his belongings, his hands shaking ever so slightly. He felt the weight of each movement, as though he were being dragged into a nightmare he couldn't escape. The officer's eyes never left him, but there was no malice in them, only a cold professionalism that made everything feel even more surreal. As he moved toward the exit of the plane, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. No one spoke. The sound of the overhead compartment closing behind him was louder than he remembered it being. He didn't turn around to see if anyone was watching, but he could feel the heavy silence following him. What had just happened? Outside the plane, Gavriel was escorted to a small security office where he was asked to wait while the staff processed the situation. He was alone, his thoughts swirling. Had there been a misunderstanding? Was this truly about security, or was there something more to it? An hour passed before anyone spoke to him again. A supervisor arrived, offering a brief apology for the inconvenience, but there was no real explanation for why he had been removed from the flight. The words felt hollow. Gavriel wasn't looking for an apology, he needed answers. But none were forthcoming. The next flight to Leuven wasn't until the next day. Gavriel felt the weight of exhaustion press upon him as he sat in a chair, staring out at the tarmac. He couldn't help but feel the sting of injustice. The reason for his removal was still unclear, but deep down he knew that it had something to do with his appearance. Something about the way he looked had made the security officer feel uncomfortable, threatened even. It wasn't the first time he had experienced something like this, but it never got easier to understand. The next day, Naya Zorash was back at her post, the cold steel of the security terminal reminding her of the duties that came with the job. She stood, looking out at the bustling airport below, but her mind wasn't focused on the usual checks or procedures. It was consumed by the events of the day before, the interaction with Father Gavriel. She had walked off the plane feeling justified, knowing she had acted swiftly and decisively. But as the hours wore on, the confidence that had initially surged within her began to erode. First came the complaints, passengers who had questioned the decision to remove a man who had done nothing wrong. They had expressed their confusion, some even outright anger, at how a priest, someone clearly of good standing, had been treated like a criminal. At first, Naya had dismissed the complaints, telling herself that her judgment had been correct. After all, security protocols were not something to be taken lightly. She had a responsibility to ensure that nothing was out of place, especially on a crowded flight. But something gnawed at her. The way Father Gavriel had looked at her, calm, composed and unafraid, was not what she had expected. She had been anticipating anger, resistance, perhaps even aggression. Instead, he had quietly complied, gathering his things without protest. And that was the moment that continued to haunt her. The way he hadn't argued. The way he hadn't raised his voice or become defensive. Was he so meek because he was afraid, or had she simply overreacted? As the day went on, Naya found it impossible to push the thoughts aside. She kept replaying the encounter in her mind, imagining different scenarios where she could have acted differently. Had she overstepped? Was it possible that her assumptions had clouded her judgment? She knew that biases, both conscious and unconscious, had a way of influencing decisions, but she hadn't recognized how deeply hers had shaped the way she saw Father Gavriel. A sharp knock on the door snapped her out of her reverie. The supervisor stood in the doorway, holding a clipboard. "Zorash," he said with a terse tone, "we've received some reports about yesterday's incident. I need you to come with me." Naya's heart sank. Her mind instantly raced to the worst possible conclusions. She had heard the whispers from her colleagues, people talking about how her actions had been questionable and how a few passengers had even raised concerns to the airline management. She had hoped that nothing serious would come of it, but the stern look on her supervisor's face told a different story. "I'm sorry," she muttered, trying to mask the tremor in her voice. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Her supervisor raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Instead, he motioned for her to follow. They made their way to the office of the head of security, where Naya found herself seated across from a woman she didn't know, an official-looking figure in a sharp suit. Her face was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the intensity of her gaze. "Naya Zorash," the woman began, her voice measured. "We've received several complaints about your handling of a situation on Flight 259 yesterday. Specifically, passengers felt that the removal of one of the travelers, Father Gavriel, was unwarranted. We need to discuss this." Naya's throat tightened. She had expected something like this, but hearing the name spoken aloud made the entire ordeal seem so much more real. Father Gabriel. The man she had so carelessly escorted off the plane. I didn't mean to cause any harm, Naya began, her voice shaky. But when I saw him, I thought there might be a threat. Through the cross. I judged him based on my assumptions. The woman across from her nodded slowly. It's important to recognize the impact of these decisions. Security is about protecting passengers, yes, but it's also about ensuring fairness. What you did was not just a mistake, it was an example of racial profiling and religious bias. You judged this man based on the way he looked, not on any actual behavior that indicated a threat. Naya's face flushed. The words felt like a slap to her conscience. She had heard about profiling before, but she never imagined herself to be guilty of it. Her mind had never allowed her to believe that she could be someone who made assumptions based on appearance or faith. I know I made a mistake, Naya said quietly, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. I acted out of fear, I suppose. Fear of the unknown. The supervisor leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Fear is natural, but it's how we respond to that fear that matters. If you're going to be in a position of authority, you have to be able to differentiate between real threats and the fears we impose on others. Naya sat in stunned silence. She had always prided herself on being fair and level-headed, but in that moment, she realized how far she had strayed from those values. What had started as a simple security procedure had spiraled into something far worse, something much more insidious. She had let her own biases cloud her judgment and affected another person's life. After a long pause, the supervisor exhaled sharply. We're going to let you off with a warning, Naya. But you need to understand this. If this kind of behavior continues, it won't be tolerated. You're expected to reflect on this, and if possible, reach out to Father Gabriel and apologize. Naya nodded numbly, her mind reeling. The meeting concluded, and she found herself wandering the halls of the airport, lost in thought. She had made a mistake, a big one. And while the consequences were not as severe as they could have been, the internal consequences weighed heavily on her. Her gaze fell on the phone in her hand. It was time to make things right. She had no idea how Father Gabriel would respond, but the least she could do was apologize, truly and deeply apologize, for the injustice she had caused. Naya's fingers hovered over the keypad. She knew that writing a message wasn't enough. She needed to speak to him, to hear his voice. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the number that had been provided to her by the airline, the church's contact number. She waited as the phone rang, her nerves tightening with every passing second. Finally, the line clicked and a calm voice answered. Father Gabriel? Naya's voice trembled, but she pushed through the anxiety. This is Naya Zorash. I wanted to apologize for what happened yesterday. I made a terrible mistake, and I realize now how wrong I was. I judged you based on how you looked, and I treated you unfairly. Please, I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Naya's heart pounded in her chest. Finally, Gabriel spoke. His voice, though gentle, carried a weight of authority. Naya, I appreciate you reaching out. Your apology means something. But know that we all have biases to confront. It's the courage to face them that defines us. For the first time since the incident, Naya felt a slight sense of relief. She wasn't sure what forgiveness would look like, but this was a start. And for her, it was just the beginning of a long road ahead, one where she would need to continually confront her own biases and learn from her mistakes.